It started with a screech, not from tires, but from Karen Dobbins' voice echoing across Maple Ridge Lane, as she spotted a black sedan parked directly across from her perfectly manicured driveway. A violation in her eyes of everything sacred, about the HOA guidelines she'd practically memorized. "Who parks like that? That's not even straight," she yelled to no one in particular, already pulling out her HOA clipboard like it was a sheriff's badge. The car hadn't even been there 10 minutes, but Karen was already dialing 911, her fingers trembling with righteous fury as if this was a national emergency. "Yes, I need police immediately. There's an unauthorized vehicle blocking a fire zone," she claimed, her voice laced with false urgency. The truth? It was a visiting nurse's car parked legally at the curb to tend to an elderly man, Mr. Langston, recovering from a recent stroke. But that didn't matter to Karen, to her. The rules mattered more than compassion, and she was going to make an example out of someone today. Before the dispatcher could even finish verifying her address, Karen was marching back outside, snapping photos of the car. From every angle, like she was building a case for the Supreme Court. What Karen didn't know was that a new neighbor across the street, Nora Jennings, had watched the entire scene unfold through her living room window, her eyebrows raised and coffee forgotten on the side table. Nora had just moved into the neighborhood 3 weeks earlier, lured in by the peaceful streets and supposedly friendly HOA, but friendly wasn't the word she'd use after witnessing this circus. Nora grabbed her phone and started filming, not out of malice, but because something about Karen's behavior felt so over the top that it needed to be documented. The nurse, a middle-aged woman named Carla, returned to her car just as the first police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing unnecessarily. On the quiet street, "Is this your vehicle, ma'am?" the officer asked, glancing at his notepad. "Yes, sir. I'm a home health nurse. I was checking on my patient, Mr. Langston. He just had a stroke." She handed over her credentials, but Karen stormed in. Before the officer could say anything, "She's lying. That man has been walking around fine all week. I saw him get the mail yesterday. This is an abuse of parking privilege." The officer gave her a look that could wither paint. "Ma'am, please step back. Let me handle this." But Karen wasn't done. "She's endangering lives. What if a fire truck needs to get through?" she continued, pointing dramatically toward the fire hydrant that was, in reality, nearly 40 feet away. The officer sighed, then turned to Carla and calmly verified her documents. Everything checked out, and more importantly, the car was legally parked according to city code. He gently handed her license back. "You're good to go." "Sorry for the inconvenience," but Karen was now on a tear. "You're not going to ticket her?" "Tow the car." "What kind of law enforcement is this?" she barked, her hands flailing. The officer, now visibly annoyed, asked her to lower her voice. That's when Nora stepped out from across the street, still filming. "Hi there. Just wanted to say I caught everything on video in case there's any question about what really happened." Karen's head snapped toward Nora like a hawk spotting prey. "Are you spying on me?" she screamed. "You're filming me without consent? That's illegal." Nora stayed calm. Public street. Public behavior. I'm just making sure truth isn't buried under drama. The officer nodded at Nora appreciatively and asked Karen once more to return to her property. Grudgingly, Karen stomped back toward her porch, but not before muttering, "This isn't over. The HOA will hear about this." She slammed her front door so hard, the porch light flickered. Carla, shaken but relieved, thanked Nora and the officer before driving away. But the story didn't end there. Within 2 hours, Karen had emailed the entire HOA board with screenshots, a copy of her 911 transcript, and a demand that Carla be permanently banned from visiting the neighborhood. What she didn't know was that several board members, including the president, had already received calls from other residents complaining about her behavior, not just today, but over the past few months. This was the 5th time she had called emergency services for what turned out to be minor parking issues or suspicious loitering, which often turned out to be delivery drivers, gardeners, or neighbors waiting for their kids. Nora, meanwhile, decided to share the video clip online in a local Facebook group called Maple Ridge Real Talk, a private community forum where neighbors vented, shared recommendations, or just told stories, her post was simple. New here. Saw this happen. Today? Is this normal HOA behavior? The video showed Karen snapping photos, yelling at the officer, and then turning on Nora for filming. Within minutes, the post exploded with comments. Oh my God, not again. She did the same thing to my niece's Uber driver. That's Karen, our resident HOA hawk. Others shared stories of their own, run-ins with her, lawn-length citations, mailbox color violations, kids told to keep quiet while playing outside. Nora hadn't expected such a reaction, but clearly, this wasn't just about one crit. It was about years of built-up frustration with a woman who believed she ruled the block. The next morning, the HOA board called for an emergency meeting. Karen arrived first, proudly setting down her binder filled with evidence, expecting praise for her vigilance. But she didn't see the tired looks on the board members' faces. She didn't realize that her authority was already slipping. Karen, we've received several complaints about misuse of emergency services, the president began. This needs to stop. Karen scoffed, complaints on protecting the neighborhood. But as they laid out the calls, the false alarms, and the video now circulating online, even she began to realize the tide was turning. This is harassment, plain and simple, one board member said. And if you can't show restraint, we may need to reconsider your place on the board. Karen was stunned. For years, she had treated the HOA like her personal army. But now, the neighborhood was waking up, and they weren't on her side anymore. If you enjoy wild, real-life-inspired neighborhood drama where power trips meet unexpected consequences, then don't miss the rest of this insane story. Stick with Sham Stories as we dive deeper into what happens when a clipboard queen finally meets her match. Karen stood frozen outside the HOA community center long after the board had dismissed the meeting. She couldn't believe what had just happened. For the first time in over 6 years, her authority had been challenged. Not only challenged, but directly threatened by the very people who once praised her for her dedication to neighborhood integrity. The words, "We may need to reconsider your place on the board," echoed in her ears like a slow-motion wreck. Her jaw clenched as she stormed back home, the wheels in her head spinning rapidly as she thought about how to flip the narrative in her favor. She believed this was a coordinated attack fueled by nosy new neighbors like Nora who didn't respect structure, discipline, or property value preservation. She sat in her kitchen, flipping through her printed HOA guidelines binder, adding sticky notes to vague sections she could weaponize later. Across the street, Nora watched from her living room window as Karen paced back and forth on her porch, muttering into her phone. She wasn't spying, not really. But Karen's presence was loud in every way. Her booming phone voice, the snap of her camera, and the way she glared at anyone passing her yard like they were intruders. Nora hadn't meant to start a movement by posting the video, but the overwhelming support from neighbors gave her the confidence to finally speak up. That evening, Nora received a message from a neighbor named Clint, a retired firefighter who had lived on the street for 20 years. "I've got stories," the message began. They arranged to meet at Nora's home the next day. Clint arrived with a folder full of documents, incident reports, complaint letters, and even a signed petition from 2 years ago asking the HOA to restrict Karen's authority. She had it buried, he said. "We tried to stand up to her before, but she called emergency services on half the people who signed, said we were harassing her." He handed Nora a photo of a tow truck dragging away a car, his son's car, legally parked during a weekend visit. She said it was abandoned. "My son was inside the house having dinner." Nora realized the issue wasn't just Karen being overzealous. It was a pattern of intimidation disguised as community care. Over the next few days, more stories surfaced. An elderly woman named Patricia, who'd lived in the neighborhood since it was built, recounted how Karen fined her twice for unsightly lawn decor after putting a small angel statue in her flower bed. "She told me it didn't fit the HOA aesthetic," Patricia said, tearing up. "It was for my late husband." A single mother down the street had footage of Karen photographing her kids from her car window, claiming they were damaging the grass while playing tag. Parents had been called. Complaints had been filed. But Karen always twisted the narrative, claiming she was the one being harassed. She had created a neighborhood of silence where people kept their heads down just to avoid being her next target. But now things were changing. Nora compiled everything, the stories, the documents, the HOA meeting notes, into a single digital file. She drafted a detailed letter and submitted it to the HOA board titled Pattern of Abuse under the guise of compliance. She didn't post it publicly, at least not yet, but she copied several influential neighbors who she knew were already fed up. The board met again privately 2 days later. Karen was not invited. When she found out, she marched down to the community center and demanded to be let in, banging on the locked doors and shouting, "This is a violation of protocol." But the doors remained closed. Inside, the board reviewed the complaints, the 911 call logs, and the video Nora had originally posted. It was undeniable. Karen had gone too far. The president, a man named Theo, who had once defended Karen's commitment to neighborhood standards, shook his head in disbelief. "We can't pretend this is about rules anymore. It's personal. It's targeted. It's dangerous." The board voted unanimously to suspend Karen's role pending further review. A notice was posted to the official HOA bulletin board and emailed to every resident. Karen was livid. She printed the notice out and scribbled lies across it, in red marker, taping it to her front door like a war declaration. Then she called the local news. She told them she was being politically silenced by a radical group of new residents trying to undermine the values of the neighborhood. A reporter did show up, but they also spoke to Nora, to Clint, to Patricia, and several others. What resulted was a balanced news segment showing both sides, but the footage of Karen yelling into her phone while standing in front of her. The sun-covered house didn't do her any favors. The comments under the article were brutal. People had seen this behavior before in HOAs around the country, and they weren't buying the victim act. Still, Karen wasn't finished. She tried filing a complaint against Nora for digital harassment, but it was dismissed. She then emailed a 12-page letter to the city council accusing the HOA board of conspiracy and discrimination. The letter was flagged as delusional by the city clerk, who read it aloud during a staff meeting. Publicly, Karen was spiraling. Privately, she was unraveling. Her once pristine yard grew slightly wild as she spent more time indoors trying to manage her image online. She created a blog called HOA Truth Watch, where she chronicled her version of events, painting herself as a lone hero fighting against laziness and lawlessness. But no one followed it, except for Nora, who used the posts as further documentation of Karen's paranoia. Meanwhile, with Karen suspended, peace started to return to Maple Ridge Lane. Neighbors began talking again. Kids played freely. Block-wide garage sale was organized for the first time in years. Theo announced an emergency board election to fill Karen's seat permanently. Nora didn't want to run. She had no interest in power, but Clint convinced her. Already trust you. You've got the backbone and the receipts, he said. So Nora ran. Her campaign wasn't flashy. A single flyer, simple text, respect, fairness, community. Karen, of course, tried to run as a write-in candidate. She printed dozens of flyers herself, using old pictures of her with the mayor. At a community cleanup event from 2012, she taped them to every mailbox. They were taken down within hours by the HOA for violating the very same signage rules she once enforced so obsessively. The vote was held at the community center. Nora received 78% of the vote. Karen received 6 write-ins, one of which was suspected to be her own. When the results were posted, there was no gloating. Nora simply said thank you and promised transparency. That night, Karen's porch lights stayed off. For the first time in weeks, there were no phone calls to the police, no angry emails, no clipboard patrols. The neighborhood was still, and for many that silence was the sweetest sound they'd heard in years. But Karen wasn't done, not yet. She had one last card to play. It was going to be big. Karen had always believed she was the kind of person who would go down swinging, and as far as she was concerned, the neighborhood was now under siege by a mob of rule-hating freeloaders led by Nora, who she imagined twirling invisible puppet strings over every resident like a sorceress casting a charm. After the election results confirmed that Nora had officially taken her place on the HOA board with an overwhelming majority, Karen became a ghost in plain sight, her blinds perpetually drawn, her car parked at odd angles to avoid imagined watchers. Her daily patrols now replaced with long, disjointed rants posted on her barely visited blog and neighborhood group forums. But for all her ranting, the real danger began the moment Karen decided to escalate from passive online whining to active sabotage. While the rest of the neighborhood exhaled in the calm, taking back their sidewalks and waving to one another, without fear of being cited for lingering, Karen dug in like a cornered animal. Her plan began with a single folder she titled Evidence of HOA, Fraud, and Corruption. A chaotic collection of half-baked screenshots, speculative email threads, and blurry photographs that she claimed proved Nora's leadership was built on deceit. She printed over 200 pages of it, had it spiral-bound at the UPS store, and mailed copies to the city's zoning office, the mayor's office, the county clerk, and most bafflingly, the Department of Homeland Security. Most of the recipients either laughed, trashed, or quietly filed the packet away as the ramblings of a disgruntled homeowner. But one agency actually responded, the local police department, not to investigate Nora, but to investigate Karen for repeatedly filing false reports, including that 911 call over the parked car weeks earlier that had sparked the entire spiral. Officer Reynolds, the same officer who had responded to that call, showed up on Karen's doorstep with a formal notice requesting her appearance at a local precinct for questioning related to abuse of emergency services. She slammed the door in his face, yelling that she needed to speak to her lawyer. The next day, she stormed into the HOA office building with a mini recorder in her hand and began loudly accusing Nora of colluding with law enforcement. Nora remained calm, even as Karen ranted and raved in front of 3 other residents who had stopped in to pay dues. Nora finally looked Karen in the eyes and said, "If you want to accuse me of a crime, you should go ahead and do it formally. Otherwise, this is harassment." Karen's lip quivered, her face turning a shade of red only seen on thermometers. But she turned and walked out, muttering something about getting the media involved again. That night, Karen launched her final move on anonymous tips sent to every member of the HOA mailing list from a burner email account titled HOO Truthwatch 77. The email alleged that Nora had illegally manipulated HOA votes by bribing residents with favors and influence. The so-called proof was a misinterpreted text exchange between Tona and Clint, arranging a group cleanup of an overgrown community lot. The rest of the email was riddled with paranoid language, citing deep state HOA control and patterned psychological conditioning tactics, which, if nothing else, amused most recipients more than it alarmed them. But the email did prompt the HOA board to open a formal review not against Nora, but against Karen, who was now suspected of not only abuse of authority, but also community-wide defamation. When the IP address of the anonymous email was trace courtesy of a board member's nephew who worked in cybersecurity, it led directly back to Karen's home network. The board called an emergency hearing, inviting Karen to defend herself, but she refused to attend, claiming it was a kangaroo court. Still, per protocol, the hearing moved forward. Dozens of neighbors attended, some to support Nora, others just to see what fresh drama would unfold. Clint, Patricia, and even Carlotha, nurse, who had unintentionally sparked Karen's spiral with her parked car, spoke briefly about their experiences, each one painting a clear picture of what living under Karen's version of HOA governance had been like. Then came Nora, who didn't offer a speech but rather read a simple timeline of events. supported with documents, videos, and a printout of Karen's own blog posts and false claims. It was calm, factual, and damning. After just 30 minutes of deliberation, the HOA board voted unanimously to permanently ban Karen from holding any position on the HOA board or attending meetings unless directly invited. They also filed a formal cease and desist letter warning her that further false claims or harassment could result in civil legal action. Word spread quickly across the neighborhood, and while no one celebrated openly, the air shifted again. A large chalk message appeared overnight on the sidewalk across from Karen's home, written by an unknown neighbor. "Freedom from fear lives here now." Karen didn't come outside for 3 full days. Her lawn began to brown. Her front light stayed off. Packages piled at her doorstep. Some wondered if she had finally accepted defeat. But those who knew Karen knew better. She was brooding, not retreating. On the 4th night, security footage from a neighbor's Ring camera caught Karen walking across the street at 2:47 a.m., dressed in black and quietly ripping up one of the newly planted community signs that read "Welcome to Maple Ridge, where neighbors are friends." The footage made its way to the HOA board by morning, and within hours, the board filed a restraining order barring Karen from interfering with or vandalizing community property. The order was signed by a local judge that afternoon. That same judge also signed off on a small claims court case filed by Carla, the nurse, who sued Karen for filing a false 911 report that affected her job performance and required legal counsel. In court, Karen fumbled. Her defense was weak, her facts jumbled, and her tone hostile. Carla, calm and composed, had Nora, Clint, and even Officer Reynolds testify on her behalf. The judge awarded Carla damages, citing Karen's pattern of escalating, baseless, and harmful behavior. This wasn't just a loss, this was public humiliation with a court transcript. And still, Karen didn't apologize. She retreated. Further, rarely seen outside again, the once dominating presence now reduced to a shadow behind drawn blinds. Nora didn't take pleasure in Karen's collapse, but she did take pride in the neighborhood finally healing. Clint, Patricia, and several others began organizing events that hadn't happened in years: a summer barbecue, a kids' movie night on the lawn, and a holiday decorating contest that brought families out in laughter instead of in fear. Even the once tense HOA meetings became productive, with actual discussions instead of one-woman monologues. As the weeks passed, Nora received letters from several neighbors thanking her for standing up, for bringing truth and fairness back to Maple Ridge. One letter simply read, "You reminded us that we live here. We're not ruled here, Nora." Framed it and hung it near her front door. And yet something about the quiet across the street still unsettled her. Karen was down, but she wasn't the type to stay down forever. Even after the court loss, restraining order, and community isolation, Karen couldn't let it go. Her pride had been gutted, but the fire inside her hadn't died. It had only turned colder and more calculating. For weeks, the street saw nothing, more than occasional flickers of light through her drawn blinds and the quiet rumble of her garbage bins, being wheeled out at night like she was trying not to be seen. The neighborhood had mostly moved on, embracing the new calm and sense of openness that came with her silence. Nora, now fully integrated into the community and serving effectively on the HOA board, had helped restore a sense of balance. Clint and Patricia were planning another community garden build, and even kids were allowed to draw chalk art on the sidewalks without hearing about regulation violations. But Nora's instincts kept her cautious, especially when one morning, she found a plain manila envelope slipped under her front door with no stamp, no address, and no handwriting on the outside. Inside were blurry printouts of images taken through her own living room window, photos of her sitting at the table, reading a book, watching TV, even yawning. There was no message, just the photos. Nora's stomach dropped, and the unease settled. And fast. She immediately called Clint and the HOA board president, Theo. Within an hour, the board filed a police report, and an officer came to the house to collect the envelope. The officer quietly examined Nora's house and then pointed out a small decorative opening in the shrub line directly across the street right in front of Karen's living room. "She's still watching," he said quietly. She's doing it in the shadows now. The neighborhood may have turned a corner publicly, but Karen's behavior had grown even more invasive behind the scenes. According to two different neighbors, she had recently been seen walking along the backyards at night, snapping photos with a flashless camera, mumbling to herself, and even placing sticky notes on fences early in the morning with cryptic messages like "violate structure." Code for .2.6 and HOA has rules for a reason. No one ever saw her do it in the act. She was careful now, but the pattern was unmistakable. Then one afternoon, Patricia returned from the grocery store to find her garage door spray-painted with the word "here" in thick red letters. Nora, Clint, and 3 others came over immediately to help her clean it. The paint came off, but the feeling didn't. Nora knew she had to act. At the next HOA board meeting, she presented all the latest incidents, including the photos from her house, the graffiti, and 3 new complaints from neighbors who had caught Karen digging through recycling bins on trash night. "We've given her chances," Nora said. "We've followed procedure, we've gone to court, we've respected the legal system. She's escalating again." Theo, though usually measured and composed, agreed instantly. "We need to involve law enforcement directly and escalate to community protection orders if necessary." The board approved funding for 3 neighborhood security cameras to be installed at street entry points, not to target any one person, but to create a full perimeter of visibility for the safety of everyone. Karen, of course, noticed them immediately. Within 2 days, she was back to sending long all-caps emails to the HOA's shared inbox. One read, "You have turned this neighborhood into a surveillance state. This is America, not communist China." Another said, "I will sue for invasion of privacy." But no one responded. The cameras had already been approved under city guidelines, and more importantly, they worked. One night, at around 3:41 a.m., one of the new cameras captured Karen walking across Clint's front yard, carrying a bag of something. She stopped near his car, crouched down for 10 seconds, and then walked away. The next morning, Clint started his car and immediately heard a strange metallic clang. He cut the engine and checked underneath. A row of roofing nails had been scattered just behind the rear wheels. He handed the footage over to the police, who opened a formal investigation into criminal mischief and property endangerment. News began to spread, and the neighborhood once again stood on edge. Only this time there was no laughter, no viral video humor, just real concern. Nora checked in with neighbors one by one, making sure everyone felt safe, especially the elderly, and families with small kids. Many of them had already changed their routines, walking dogs earlier, keeping porch lights on longer, avoiding eye contact with Karen's house entirely. Then came the final straw. Late one Friday evening, Nora and her sister Jessica, who was visiting for the weekend, were coming back from dinner. When they found their mailbox torn off its post and thrown halfway across the street, Nora walked over to pick it up and noticed it had been dented and on the side with what looked like deliberate impact marks. Jessica, without hesitation, grabbed her phone and checked the security app linked to the new HOA cameras. At 9:37 p.m., clear as day, Karen had walked across the street holding what appeared to be a crowbar, struck the mailbox several times, and then disappeared into the shadows. That footage was undeniable. This time, there was no community meeting, no internal warning, no second guessing. Officer Reynolds returned with 2 other officers and served Karen with a formal criminal trespass and vandalism charge right at her front door. She screamed. She protested. She cried about conspiracies. But the body cams caught it all, and neighbors recorded from windows and porches as Karen was escorted to the patrol car, her house slippers barely holding on as she shouted at Nora, "You poisoned them all. You ruined this place." Nora didn't respond. She stood still, arms crossed, expression neutral, while the neighborhood watched the woman, who had ruled their lives through fear, finally get held accountable in the most public way. Karen spent a weekend in holding before being bailed out, but the damage was done. A restraining order was extended to cover a 100-foot radius from all HOA board members, and she was formally barred from attending any future HOA events indefinitely. That Monday morning, the neighborhood came alive again. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years started chatting during morning walks. Kids drew peace signs in chalk across Karen's old patrol routes. Clint fixed Patricia's mailbox, with a group of neighbors who brought donuts and coffee while they worked. And in a quiet moment, Nora stood under the tree where the first confrontation with Karen's 911 call had happened and exhaled deeply, realizing just how far they'd come. But there was still one more chapter to unfold, something unexpected, something from Karen's past that no one saw coming. The street was finally breathing again. But just when the neighborhood had begun to settle into its new rhythm, something surfaced that even Nora hadn't expected. Something from Karen's past that explained more than anyone could have guessed. It began with a knock on Nora's door one rainy afternoon, just as she was watering her porch plants. The man at the door introduced himself as Roger Daniels, a former resident of Maple Ridge Lane who had moved away 5 years ago. "I saw the video clips online, recognized Karen immediately, figured it was time someone added some context," he said. Over coffee at Nora's kitchen table, Roger began unraveling a backstory that turned Karen's aggressive HOA reign from a mystery into a near inevitability. Years ago, Karen had been a mid-level administrator at a private charter school in another state, where she'd held a similar role involving rule enforcement, dress codes, parent access, hallway decorum. She wasn't the principal, but she acted like one, enforcing her interpretations of school policy with alarming zeal. According to Roger, whose daughter had attended that school, Karen's behavior became so overbearing that she started getting complaints not just from parents but from staff. She once reported a 6th grader for excessive backpack stickers, Roger recalled, shaking his head. She wasn't fired. But when pressure mounted and a local journalist started digging into her disciplinary record, she abruptly resigned. She moved to Maple Ridge Lane shortly after. It all made sense. Karen hadn't just turned into a tyrant when she got her clipboard. She had always been one, and the HOA had simply become her new kingdom. Nora thanked Roger and promised to share the truth only if necessary. She wasn't interested in dragging Karen through the mud, only in protecting the neighborhood from future harm. Meanwhile, with Karen now legally restricted from contacting any HOA members and still under watch for pending property damage charges, the atmosphere in Maple Ridge grew healthier by the day. The spring festival, long canceled year after year due to logistical concerns, a phrase most neighbors now recognized as Karen code for "I don't want it," was finally held on the first weekend of May. Families gathered on the community lawn. There were food trucks, a bounce house, even a live band, none of which had required a 3-week permit battle or a Karen-led subcommittee meeting. Patricia brought homemade cookies and beamed all afternoon. Clint barbecued in the rain, laughing louder than anyone. The sense of belonging was tangible. Nora, quietly walking the perimeter to make sure everything ran smoothly, was stopped constantly by residents who thanked her not just for standing up to Karen, but for giving everyone a voice again. Still, a part of Nora remained wary. She passed by Karen's house occasionally, and although the windows stayed dark and the grass unkempt, she could feel the presence behind the blinds. The storm wasn't coming, but the memory of one lingered. Then, 3 months later, just as summer was beginning to peak, a moving truck pulled into Karen's driveway. No one had seen her outside. No for sale sign had gone up, but the truck was real, and so were the movers. They worked quickly, boxing and loading while Karen remained unseen. By evening, the house was empty. Karen was gone. Word spread fast, but no one celebrated. There was relief, yes, and closure, but also reflection. People began asking themselves why it had taken so long for them to push back, why they had let someone bully an entire community for so many years. Nora helped answer that question one evening during a final HOA meeting of the season. Standing at the front of the room, she said, "We let fear settle in because we assumed power belongs to the loudest voice, but it doesn't. Power belongs to the many, not the few, and it returns the moment someone dares to speak the truth out loud." Her words echoed across the room, not with applause, but with the quiet nods of people who had lived through it all. The following week, Theo and the board unanimously approved a new neighborhood code titled Community Conduct and Oversight Reform. placing stricter limits on board power, clearer complaint procedures, and mandatory rotating leadership roles. To prevent future HOA overreach, Karen had left a legacy, but not the one she intended. She became the reason the neighborhood grew stronger, not through her leadership, but through her downfall. The parked car that started it all now existed only as a cautionary tale of control, escalation, and how quickly a community can shift when one person forgets that neighbors aren't subjects, they're equals. And perhaps the most poetic twist came when a new family moved into Karen's old house, a couple with 2 toddlers and a rescue dog who loved to run laps around the front yard. No one said a word about leash lengths or noise levels. They were welcomed with homemade brownies and warm smiles. Clint even built them a custom welcome sign. Nora waved from her porch one evening, watching the children chase Bubbles into the same street where Karen had once dialed 911 over a parked car. Life had moved on, and this time the HOA was finally on the right side of the story. If you believe in standing up against everyday tyranny, in speaking out against silence, and in defending community with kindness instead of control, then share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories, where real drama meets real justice, one clipboard at a time.